Look closely at this photograph. It's Stockholm 1890, a masterpiece of stone, iron and glass. But look at the streets. There's something wrong with them. They are perfectly paved, wide enough for thousands, and yet they are dead silent. Why is that? Historu tells us this is a long exposure glitch. But why are there no horses, no market stalls, no traces of life? What if the history books are lying to cover a much darker reality? What if we didn't build these cities? What if we just found them? Today, we peel back the layers of global conspiracy. The Great Reset of 1700, the world didn't evolve into the modern era, it was repopulated. And the evidence is buried right beneath your feet. Official census records from Stockholm at the tail end of the 19th century claim a bustling population of 250,000 residents. However, in this frame we see no pedestrians, no horse-drawn carts, and no street vendors. There is only a profound, unnatural emptiness. The standard academic explanation for this phenomenon cites long exposure times. We are told that early cameras required subjects to remain perfectly still for several minutes to be captured. Therefore, anything in motion, human beings, animals, moving wagons, simply vanished from the chemical plate. But this logic fails under closer scrutiny. Long exposure times do not erase the world, they blur it. They do not remove the debris of a busy market day. Nor do they erase a horse tied to a stationary hitching post. They certainly wouldn't erase a child sitting still on a stoop or a merchant leaning against a doorway. Yet, this same eerie silence isn't unique to Stockholm. It manifests in early photography of Paris, St. Petersburg, Chicago, and Melbourne. These were different cities on different continents, yet they all shared the same ghostly stillness. It forces a chilling question. Were these grand urban centers built for a population that hadn't arrived yet? Or was there a global event that cleared the world of its inhabitants before it was populated by us? According to conventional historical narratives, the transition into the modern world was a gradual, documented evolution. We are taught that wars reshaped borders, plagues thinned the herds, and revolutions dismantled the old monarchies. The Industrial Revolution supposedly transformed agrarian economies into mechanical powerhouses, with every shift neatly categorized in our textbooks. Historians describe the 18th and 19th centuries as a period of enlightenment and rebuilding, a time when stone replaced timber, science replaced folklore, and the Great Enlightenment finally banished the shadows of medieval stagnation. The narrative we are fed flows with a suspicious smoothness from one century to the next. Census data is presented as a reassuringly linear climb. We see European populations rising steadily decade by decade, cities expanding outward from their ancient cores, and railroads stitching together once isolated territories. On paper, everything progresses exactly as it should. However, even within these official government archives, strange footnotes and clerical errors begin to surface. In the margins of 19th century ledgers, you find estimated figures scrawled without supporting data. Whole districts were counted in 1 year, only to be recounted with radically different numbers a decade later, with no explanation for the missing souls or the sudden influx of new ones. In isolation, these discrepancies look like mere bureaucratic imperfections, the messy reality of record keeping before the digital age. But when viewed collectively, these records form a baseline that feels increasingly manufactured. They construct a reality where change was always incremental, where populations grew organically, and where cities expanded only to meet existing demand. A story repeated enough times eventually becomes part of the world's infrastructure, invisible, assumed, and rarely questioned. But infrastructure relies on the assumption of continuity, and continuity is exactly what the evidence suggests may have failed. The earliest daguerreotypes of major cities are often celebrated as a triumph of human progress. We have the famous plates of Paris boulevards commissioned during Baron Haussmann's massive urban renovations, the glass prints of Vienna's Ringstrasse, and the early photographs of Boston's government districts. These images are curated in our national archives as proof of civilization's victory over chaos, tangible evidence that humanity had finally tamed the urban landscape. Yet they all share a staggering detail that is rarely mentioned in the museum captions. They are utterly deserted, broad, majestic avenues stretch toward the horizon without a single carriage in sight. Massive government edifices stand tall with no guards at the gates. Commercial districts show pristine shopfronts. Yet there are no customers, no clerks, and no signs of the frantic commerce required to sustain such a city. In many of these images, the shadows indicate a midday sun, the peak hours of urban life. And yet the silence remains unbroken. While the long exposure excuses the go-to answer for historians, it does not explain the absence of static life. Where are the people sitting on the benches? Why are the doorways of homes standing open, yet no one is visible in the threshold? Market squares are shown with empty stalls, but where are the goods? Where are the barrels of flour, the discarded newspapers, or the tethered livestock? The photographs of Charles Marvell, taken during the 1860s in Paris, show entire neighborhoods that look like they were abandoned an hour before the shutter clicked. We see finished buildings, completed sewer systems, and freshly installed gas lamps, all waiting in a vacuum of silence. If hundreds of thousands of people lived in Paris at that time, where did they go during the day? The motion blur theory might hold up for 1 or 2 photos, but it collapses when applied to thousands of images across different decades and continents. If these cities were truly alive, where did their heartbeat go? The camera did not arrive early to document the rise of these cities. It arrived late, documenting what remained after something catastrophic had already occurred. We are taught to view our great cathedrals, capitol buildings, and train stations as monuments to generations of human labor. These structures imply a continuity of knowledge and a massive, coordinated effort over decades. Official histories provide us with the names of architects and the dates of construction, which satisfy our curiosity until we actually look at the timelines. Take Cologne Cathedral. Official records say it was started in the 13th century and finally finished in the 19th, a 600-year project. However, photographs from the 1880s show a level of stone-cutting precision and structural uniformity that suggests it was executed all at once under a single unified planting. The architectural style doesn't shift or evolve as taste changed over those 6 centuries. It appears as a singular, complete thought. Similarly, consider the civic buildings of Chicago. We are told they rose within just a few years of the Great Fire of 1871. These structures exhibited a level of neoclassical mastery usually reserved for old world civilizations with centuries of stonework tradition. Yet, they appeared in a frontier city that was barely decades old. We are told American architects were simply trained in European methods, but training doesn't grant instant, flawless expertise on a mass scale. Practice and apprenticeship take generations, yet these buildings stand fully realized as if they were inherited rather than built. St. Petersburg presents an even more glaring impossibility. Founded in 1703 on a swamp, the city supposedly reached a level of architectural sophistication within a few decades that rivaled capitals 5 times its age. We see massive palaces and perfectly coordinated infrastructure appearing far too quickly for a city built on marshland. While blueprints exist in some archives, many look like they were drawn after the buildings were already standing, intended to explain what had been found rather than to guide what was being built. The language in these old records is telling. They often describe renovations with no mention of original construction, or upgrades to infrastructure with no record of the system that preceded it. Foundations are described as reinforced, even when they show no signs of age or wear. It suggests a civilization that didn't invent its world, but simply moved into it. What if these grand buildings were not built by the people who occupy them now? What if they were claimed, renamed, and reinterpreted by a population that arrived after the old world ended? If history is organic, population growth should be predictable. In a healthy society, births outpace deaths, and immigration follows logical economic patterns. But in the 19th century, the demographic numbers began to behave erratically. Petersburg's population nearly doubled between the 1840s and 1850s, yet there are no records of a baby boom or a massive wave of immigration that could account for 200,000 new people in a single decade. San Francisco tells a similar story. We are told the 1850 gold rush created the city, but early photographs show an infrastructure already sized for a metropolis. The harbors were designed for heavy industrial traffic, and the streets were laid out for hundreds of thousands of people long before the census reached those numbers. The infrastructure preceded the population it was meant to serve, Across the American Great Plains, frontier towns show a similar pattern: grand civic architecture designed for thousands of people. While the official census recorded only a few hundred residents, the buildings were waiting empty for people who hadn't arrived yet. Perhaps the most haunting evidence of this population is the orphan train movement. Between 1854 and 1929, an estimated 200,000 children were relocated from the East Coast to rural communities across the U.S. These were millions of children appearing in institutional records with no documented lineage. Intake logs from these foundling hospitals repeat the same chilling phrases: origin unknown, parents deceased, details unavailable, found abandoned. Who were these children? And why were they being shipped by the thousands into cities and lands that seemed to have been recently vacated? Were they the new population being moved in to fill the silence of a world that had just ended? While the streets of the major capitals stood in eerie silence, a different kind of surge was occurring behind closed doors. Foundling hospitals throughout Europe, specifically in hubs like Paris, London, Moscow, and Vienna, began reporting an unprecedented and staggering volume of abandoned children during the mid to late 19th century. These massive institutional machines were established not just to house orphans, but to process thousands of human beings who arrived with absolutely no documentation, no family connections, and no verifiable personal histories. In Paris, the Hôpital des Enfants Trouvés became a central processing hub, cycling through thousands of infants annually. Historical records from this period describe a heartbreaking and bizarre scene. Infants left at turning wheels, with no identifying notes, toddlers found wandering grand boulevards with no memory of their parents, and groups of older children arriving at the gates with documentation that was either blatantly fabricated or entirely absent. The sheer scale of this crisis defies standard historical explanations. While it is true that extreme poverty, localized wars, and industrial accidents create orphans, the numbers recorded in the late 1800s surge far beyond what those causes should logically generate. More importantly, the paperwork consistently highlights a specific anomaly. These children didn't just lack parents, they lacked origins. There were no home regions identified, no prior residences on record, and no extended families that could be traced. It was as if a generation had been manifested out of thin air to fill the vacuum of the empty cities. This era also saw the bizarre phenomenon of infant incubator exhibitions at world's fairs. Premature babies were displayed as technological curiosities, where the public paid admission to view rows of infants in glass cases. Martin County's famous incubator displays toured European and American fairs for decades, starting with the Berlin exhibition of 1896. While official history frames these as medical demonstrations to promote life-saving technology, these exhibitions also served as a way to process children of murky origins into the social system. Many of the babies on display had no families to return to. They entered the modern world through the lens of a public spectacle, receiving institutional identities where none existed before. A civilization that declines gradually preserves its ancestry. Even through the darkest wars or migrations, lineage remains traceable, families hold on to their stories. But a civilization that is reset or repopulated after a sudden, catastrophic loss has no ancestry to preserve. It begins with a clean slate, with children who have no verifiable past. Only institutional intake forms marking their entry into a manufactured history. A society of orphans is a society without memory, and such a society is easily led. By the time the Chicago World's Columbian Exposition opened in 1893, it presented itself to the world as a white city, a temporary marvel of plaster and wood built in Jackson Park to celebrate 4 centuries of progress before being dismantled. Official records describe a feverish, almost superhuman construction effort involving armies of workers and architectural innovation executed under impossible deadlines. The fair spanned 600 acres, featured over 200 massive buildings, and attracted 27 million visitors in just 6 months. And then, almost as quickly as it rose, it was demolished. The official narrative insists these structures were never meant to last. They were supposedly made of staff, a mixture of plaster of Paris and hemp fiber, over wooden frames, designed for visual impact rather than longevity. While some photographs show construction materials that support this, others reveal details that tell a far more complex story. Why do photographs show foundations extending much deeper than a 6-month, temporary structure would ever require? Why did these buildings possess electrical and hydraulic systems of such immense sophistication that they rivaled or exceeded the permanent infrastructure of the city itself? Exhibition logs from the time often use curious language, describing buildings as being adapted for use rather than constructed from scratch. This suggests a process of modification rather than creation. We see this pattern repeat globally. The 1889 Paris Exposition Universelle left us the Eiffel Tower, but hundreds of other equally sophisticated structures vanished. The 1904 St. World's Fair covered a staggering 200 acres with neoclassical buildings that were stylistically coherent and structurally complete, only to be torn down within a year. Documentation claims these fairs were showcases of a future possibility, visions of what modern technology could achieve, but the photographic evidence suggests a different relationship to time. These weren't futures imagined, they look like pasts remembered. They don't look like new innovations being displayed for the first time. They look like a grand architectural inheritance being temporarily revealed to a new population before being dismantled to maintain the illusion of a slow, linear crawl toward progress. Why build the world twice? Why construct a magnificent, technologically advanced city for an exhibition, only to tear it down and build a lesser version for actual habitation? Unless, of course, these temporary cities were never built at all. Unless they were the remnants of the old world, briefly uncovered and then erased. As we return to the photographs of New York, Moscow, Melbourne, and Buenos Aires, the same chilling stillness pervades the frames. We are looking at different continents and different architectural traditions, yet the human absence is identical. Broad streets extend into the empty distance. Civic squares designed for thousands show no crowds. In some rare images, a single, blurred figure appears, a ghostly, translucent movement captured during a long exposure. This actually disproves the motion blur excuse as an all-encompassing answer. If the camera was capable of recording a single person as a ghostly blur, why is the rest of the street entirely devoid of even those blurs? One blurred person in a market square, built for 10,000, emphasizes the absence rather than explaining it. Technical manuals from the 19th century document the rapid evolution of photography. While early daguerreotypes did require minutes of stillness, the Dray plate processes of the 1870s and 80s reduced exposure times to mere seconds. By the late 1880s, snapshot photography existed, capable of freezing a bird in flight or a crowd in mid-stride. Yet, the empty streets persist across all these technological jumps. The technology advanced, but the silence remained. Even more telling is that 19th century archivists and university collectors noticed this peculiarity. Municipal records sometimes include notes in the catalogue descriptions, and usually devoid of inhabitants, or empty street scene, because unknown. They documented the strangeness in real time, yet a satisfactory explanation remained elusive. Modern historians claim photographers cleared the streets to get a clean shot of the architecture. But think of the logistics. This would require thousands of photographers in dozens of countries over a 50-year period to all agree on the exact same aesthetic of total emptiness. It would require a global, systematic erasure of human presence from the visual record of our history. Architecture across the globe aligns in ways that official history struggles to reconcile. Domes, massive columns, and intricate star-shaped fortifications appear on nearly every continent with a striking mathematical uniformity. Whether in India, Russia, or the Americas, these neoclassical structures share not just a vibe, but specific proportional relationships and decorative patterns. Official history credits this to parallel evolution, or cultural exchange via trade routes, but independent invention explains similarity, not identicality. When different cultures face the same problems, like building a roof or a fort, they often find similar functional solutions. That is logical. But what we see goes far beyond functional convergence. The proportions match with a precision that suggests a single, unified source. Star forts, for example, extraordinary geometric fortifications, appear with identical planning principles in Belgium, Sri Lanka, and South America. These are locations with no documented exchange of military engineering knowledge during the years they were supposedly built. Similarly, The neoclassical government buildings in Washington, D.C. mirror those in St. Petersburg with a proportional accuracy that cannot be explained by architects simply copying a style. Trade routes and pattern books were certainly real, but a pattern book provides a template, not an exact measurement. It inspires variation, not duplication. The buildings we see suggest the inheritance of a global, unified system rather than a slow, independent crawl toward a similar aesthetic. Beneath the local variations of material and climate, the underlying geometric grammar remains constant. This uniformity suggests a single inheritance, but from whom? Our history books provide no record of a civilization sophisticated and widespread enough to leave such a comprehensive legacy across every inhabited continent. Finally, we must address a physical anomaly that exists in nearly every major city worldwide: the buried first floor. In cities across the globe, what should be the ground floor actually sits several feet below the modern street level. We see grand windows half submerged in the earth and ornate doorways that now require a descent down a set of stairs to enter. The standard explanation is urban sediment, the idea that streets were gradually raised over centuries as new paving was laid over the old. While this does happen over millennia, as seen in ancient Rome or London, the sediment analysis in many 19th century cities suggests something different: rapid deposition. The layers of soil and debris covering these buildings do not show the gradual, messy accumulation of centuries. They appear compressed and uniform, consistent with a sudden, massive event rather than an incremental burial. Many of these infrastructure changes, which conventional history attributes to hundreds of years of growth, appear to have occurred within a single decade. Photographs from the late 19th century capture this transition in real time. We see buildings with grand, majestic entrances that were clearly designed to be at street level, now being accessed by awkward, descending steps. This physical evidence, combined with the empty streets and the orphan surge, points toward a world that didn't just grow, it was reset. If you walk through the older districts of London, Prague, or even New York, you will notice a recurring architectural oddity: windows that sit at the modern basement level, often half submerged in the sidewalk. These are not mere cellar windows for light or ventilation. Upon closer inspection, many of these windows feature ornate decorative elements, carved stone lintels, sills, and arched frames that are perfectly consistent with the grand, above-ground architecture of the building's upper floors. They were clearly designed to be seen. When utility companies excavate these streets for modern pipe or cable work, they frequently uncover something startling: the street level does not end at the pavement. Below the asphalt lies a hidden layer of history: doorways, storefront, and original ground floors that have been disconnected from the modern world. This visual evidence documents something far more significant than the gradual accumulation of urban dust. It points toward a sudden, catastrophic disconnection between the original design of these structures and the current street levels we walk upon today. The pattern is undeniably global, yet the official explanations vary wildly depending on geography. In European cities, historians point to medieval accumulation, suggesting that centuries of refuse and new paving simply piled up. However, American frontier cities, many of which were supposedly founded in the mid-19th century, possess the exact same subterranean features. These cities have no medieval period to blame. They were supposedly built on virgin land at the current street level. Yet, when you dig into the soil of Seattle, Chicago, or Kansas City, you find the same buried stories. Asian and South American metropolises document the same anomaly: original ground floors that are now subterranean. For the official narrative to be true, it would require a miraculous, coordinated effort across dozens of nations and different governmental systems, all deciding simultaneously to elevate their infrastructure by 10 to 20 feet. While some records do exist of street-raising projects, they do not document the sheer global scale of the change that archaeological evidence reveals. Something buried these buildings partially, uniformly and globally. The idea of a uniformly buried world is puzzling to the modern mind. However, a catastrophe need not be a single, worldwide Hollywood event to be civilizational in its impact. We may be looking at a series of intense regional catastrophes occurring within a concentrated time period, the late 17th to the early 18th century. Climate disruption, intense seismic activity, or atmospheric shifts could have triggered rapid sediment deposition. Imagine a world where massive amounts of soil were liquefied or moved by atmospheric pressure. A mud flood. Survivors would be forced to adapt quickly, rebuilding on top of the ruins rather than clearing them. It is far easier to turn a first floor into a basement and build a new entrance on the second floor than it is to excavate millions of tons of mud. What gets buried is often what no longer fits the narrative being constructed by the winners of history. We see evidence of architectural features suggesting different purposes, different power sources, and different populations. Systems that do not align with the official story of gradual development are literally covered over. Forgotten things are often buried, not just in the earth but in the archives. This was not an apocalypse in the sense of total extinction. There was no sudden end visible in the geological record like the asteroid that took the dinosaurs. Instead, it was a correction. Around 1700,